So I want to begin by thanking Rich and Jackie and James for organizing this very stimulating few days of exchange on the topic of mixed emotions. Carrie and I were out for a walk last night around Ann Arbor, and we couldn't help ourselves but stop and take this selfie. I promised her that I wouldn't post this on Facebook. Instead, I'm sharing it to a group of strangers at a meeting that's being tweeted live to thousands of people. You can't see this, but she's sitting back there, and that's actually the exact expression that she has right now. I look a little constipated in that picture. I'm going to talk about affective complexity, which is another term. I want to be clear that I'm not going to talk about affective co-occurrence, which I think hews closer to I think Jeff's work and even Dale's work on mixed emotions. And I tend to agree with Dale that to the extent that mixed emotions represent a kind of surgency of positive and negative affect, it may be a state that's not very sustainable, and maybe over time, maybe a barometer of stress. That's just my speculation. Instead, I'm going to talk about affective complexity, and I also want to say that when I talk about when I define affective complexity, I'm not talking about differentiation within valence. And so I know this is an area of research that has captivated some amount of attention, and people have come up with various descriptors such as emotional granularity and emo diversity. Here I'm simply referring to the association between positive and negative affect under conditions of stress. Okay, so now that I've told you that I'm not going to talk about mixed emotions, I can go ahead and start the rest of my talk here. So the research that I'll be describing today can be summarized with the term affective complexity. And here I just want to acknowledge the work of my collaborator, Alex Zotra, whose model of affect dynamics has, I think, provided some testable explanations for a diverse set of findings in the literature. So the organization of this talk will be a little bit of background, a little bit of data, and a little bit of remedy, or what to do about the problem of how best to capture the ebb and flow of affect in our everyday lives. So we've heard this throughout this meeting that most of us believe that positive feelings are not the opposite of negative feelings, and that a person who's unhappy is also sad. These statements are, I think, truisms in the sort of language of feelings, as fundamental as 1 + 1 = 2. And I want to suggest that in this talk, 1 + 1 does not equal 2, at least when it comes to comparing our positive and negative affective states. And instead, and this is to sort of forecast the bottom line of this talk, I want to suggest that the degree of, relationship between our positive and negative affects is a function of the state of the person when they're being assessed. And one of the central points of this talk is that that interrelationship is a function, or can be a function, of stress. Okay, so the conceptual foundation for much of the work I'll be describing today comes from the dynamic model of affect proposed by Zotra and colleagues. And much of this research was informed or motivated by two sort of seemingly contradictory views in the literature, one that posits that positive and negative affect are independent, and another that presumes they are highly inversely coupled. And the model proposed by Zotra, I think, attempts to integrate both the bivariate and bipolar models of affect, and suggests that stress may influence the degree of that affect relationship. Okay, so the sort of central contextual feature here, as I've alluded to, is the degree of stress that a person is undergoing. So in times of times of virus messages, in times of calm and predictability, when stress is low, information processing capacity is at its maximum, and the model predicts that individuals are able to process information from multiple inputs, with the resultant ability to report both positive and negative affect relatively independently. However, the model also predicts that this dynamic process is involved here, and independence is not a stable state. In particular, stressful events generate uncertainty, and that uncertainty places demands on cognitive processing, and that those demands, in a sense, collapse affective space, leading people to more likely experience their affects in a bipolar fashion. Okay, so a number of empirical tests of the dynamic model of affect have been employed across a wide range of fields and laboratory assessments and samples, and I want to just briefly highlight some of the work that we and others have done in this area as a test of this model. And so I'm going to talk about data from various vulnerable populations where stress is conceived both as a sort of chronic strain, but also in terms of, as you will see, acute stressors in the laboratory. So I'll start with chronic pain. So the dynamic model of affect proposes that stressful contexts influence affective information processing to the extent that stress sort of influences our affective relationships. So one example of this is chronic pain. Those with chronic pain, you might sort of argue, are already experiencing a stressor that places cognitive demands on the system, and the pain itself may be seen as a stressor. And we know that compared to healthy controls, chronic pain patients are more likely to report a tendency to process information in a simple fashion. And one established consequence of painful events is that there is an increase in negative affect during pain episodes. So we wanted to sort of test this prediction out in a sample of chronic pain patients. These were patients with a diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis who were assessed their positive and negative affect and their pain on a daily basis. The measure of positive and negative affect we use here was the sort of ubiquitous PANIS. This is how we measured pain using a anatomic figure, and essentially people's daily ratings of pain were averaged across these various pain sites to yield a daily index of pain. Oh, I also should say that, just to return to this measure of daily affect and the use of the PANIS, I think one could argue that departures from relative independence between positive and negative affect need to be tested with descriptor terms that are not opposites to yield scale scores for positive affect that are not expected to show strong inverse correlations with scale scores from negative affect. And I think it's worth noting here that such a condition occurs with the PANIS, whereby you see these high activation terms that are fairly lowly correlated. So I think this, people sort of harp on the PANIS, but I think the use of the PANIS is appropriate here in testing this sort of model of affect and the degree to which our affects are correlated with one another under conditions of stress. Okay, so just to cut to the results here, this is just a simple plot of the average intra-individual correlation on days characterized by high and low pain. And of interest here is the interaction between positive affect and pain. So consistent with predictions from the dynamic model of affect, these data suggest that increases in daily pain were related to a stronger inverse association between positive and negative affect. And this finding, again, is consistent with the model's prediction that stress may provoke a kind of change in the way in which we understand our positive and negative emotions. Okay, so given that stress is a central mechanism whereby our affects become inversely related, another question is whether affect relationships may be useful in differentiating people with various affective disorders such as anxiety and depression. And this was the question that motivated the next study that I want to describe. So recent investigations into the underlying factor structure of positive and negative affect suggest that there may be significant differences between people with anxiety and depression, not only in terms of their levels of positive and negative affect, but also in terms of the relationship between these core affective systems. So work by Clark and Watson, for example, suggests that those diagnosed with depression show a significant deficit in positive affect relative to those who experience anxiety. Work by Barlow suggests that chronic apprehension and uncertainty are central features of anxiety disorder. And so the reasoning here is if that sort of chronic apprehension and uncertainty is a kind of feature of stress that we see in, for example, the chronic pain patients, perhaps those with anxiety disorders should show this collapse in affective space more so than those who have depression, for whom this is not a salient feature of the syndrome. So we, again, sort of tested this idea. This is a study of a group of patients who were diagnosed through trained therapists in terms of anxiety and depression. And so as predicted from some of the work by Watson and Clark, there was an overall deficit in positive affect in depressed participants compared to anxiety participants. Depressed participants also showed higher scores on negative affect compared to those with anxiety disorder. And anxious participants showed a significantly higher inverse correlation between positive and negative affect than was found in the depressed group. So this is a plot that illustrates the latent factor structure of positive and negative affect for patients with either an anxiety disorder or a depressive disorder. And here, test of invariance essentially demonstrated equivalence of factor loading. So there was a point yesterday about how the use of eigenvalues may obscure differences in factor structure, which I think is a fair point. Here we're essentially constraining the factor loadings to be the same across these two groups, and we're also constraining the latent factor correlations to be the same, and we're testing whether departures from those models are significant. And indeed they are, so the model fits very poorly when you constrain this correlation to be the same. The top correlation here represents the correlation between positive and negative affect for the depressed group, the bottom for the top for the anxious group, and the bottom for the depressed group. And again, this is sort of consistent with predictions from the dynamic model of affect to the extent that stress collapses affective space, to the extent that one sort of feature of stress is uncertainty, and to the extent that uncertainty is a salient factor within those with anxiety, we should see more of this sort of inverse association in these sort of contexts. Okay, so I should say that missing from this study is, for those of you who are clinical psychologists, is a non-clinical control group. And so we really can't say anything about what's normative here. More generally, these results leave open the question as to whether increased affective complexity is indeed associated with improved adjustment following stress, right? So this is another question I think that has been raised throughout this meeting. And so for this question, I turn to the work of a recent collaborator of mine, George Bonanno, whose work on resilience, and here resilience across many of these studies, is defined as the maintenance of relatively stable, healthy levels of psychological functioning. And Bonanno has found across many of these studies of so-called potentially traumatic life events, that the resilience trajectory is the modal trajectory. It's the trajectory that occurs in a majority of these studies. So this is just an illustration of all the studies that George has done looking at this question. And the thing to sort of pay attention to is that resilient trajectory that I showed you earlier, that prototypic trajectory, is found in a majority of these studies across a whole host of potentially traumatic life experiences. Essentially showing that people evidence really minimal impact across these experiences. So the question is, from the perspective of the dynamic model of affect, in the context of a potentially traumatic life experience such as bereavement, are resilient individuals more likely to exhibit this greater independence between positive and negative affect, what we're calling affective complexity, in the months in the early months following bereavement, compared to those who have been characterized as symptomatic. And this is actually data from a study done by Kaufman and Bonanno. So this is a study involving 54 bereaved adults, and I should say that the data for this study was part of a larger study in which resilient and symptomatic categories were determined through some very complicated growth mixture models. The point is, can we differentiate these two groups, the so-called resilient group and the symptomatic group, in terms of their affective relationships? So negative and positive affect scores were compiled here by calculating each participant's mean score for each valence at each of the 4 assessment waves. And here, affect complexity was simply derived as a correlation, an inter-affect correlation after Fisher's transformation across those 4 waves of measurement. And the basic finding here is that the group that's so-called resilient, prototypic trajectory of low psychological sort of distress, showed the weaker correlation here compared to those who were symptomatic. In fact, the symptomatic group showed a near collapse in affective structure. The correlation between positive and negative affect was 0.95. Okay, so now I'm zipping through here. Up until this point, I've presented findings generated from sort of short-term, so-called micro-longitudinal studies to examine stress-affect relationships. However, complementary data are also available from laboratory-based work as well. And these data that I'm about to show you come from an experimental manipulation of stress. The stressful task here is the famous Trier social stress test. People have to give a speech, they have to prepare the speech and deliver it. And positive and negative affect was assessed 4 times during the experiment. So once before the stressor task, immediately following it, and twice during a recovery phase. Okay, so these are the results displayed graphically here. And what they show is that the relationship between positive and negative affect become significantly inverse only at the point immediately following the stressor. In contrast, positive and negative affect were independent, relatively speaking, before the task and during the longer recovery period. So we made an attempt here to control for measurement error in this study that could have influenced these relationships. So the data were subjected to confirmatory factor analysis, and parcel scores for positive and negative affect were constructed for the pre-task and post-task stress. And the correlation between these latent variables were estimated using an SEM framework. And the basic strategy here is similar to the one that was employed in the mood disorder study, which was to estimate the correlation between positive and negative affect after constraining those correlations to be equal to one another and seeing the change in model fit. And basically what you see here is that the model fits fairly poorly when you constrain the correlations to be equal. So under conditions of stress, you see that correlation is negative 0.57 and negative 0.31 under under no stress. So here's, I think, some experimental data suggesting that when we control the environment, so to speak, in terms of what type of stress people are experiencing, you see this sort of divergence in their way of understanding sort of their emotions in terms of this inverse correlation. Okay, so one final question is, are there individual difference factors that could likely play a role in affect differentiation? And in our work, we sort of have probed for individual differences in within subject correlations between positive and negative affect, and have found evidence that not everyone shows this same pattern of relationships whereby our affects are bipolar under stress. And you recall that the dynamic model of affect suggests that a sort of decrease in the complexity of information processing during stress accounts for this collapse in affective space. And to the extent that there are sort of individual difference measures that tap this sort of informational cognitive load, you might anticipate those factors to be also relevant in affect differentiation. So this is just a summary slide of a number of studies that have been done in this area. And consistent with the general prediction, we find that the correlation between the affects vary depending on various vulnerability factors that reflect, again, this sort of constriction in information processing, such as those reflected in cognitive simplicity, neuroticism, hostility, and a recent study we did on perceived discrimination. Of course, another implication from this model is that factors that sort of relax information demand should lead to greater affect differentiation, and this sort of broadening of awareness would be manifested in lower correlations between positive and negative affect. And in our work, we have found evidence of this in terms of various individual difference factors, such as mood clarity, trait resilience, extroversion, and trait positive affect. These factors tend to contribute to greater affect differentiation, particularly under conditions of stress. Okay, so just to summarize here, I think one implication of adopting a context-dependent view of affect relationships, and I think Susan and others have made this point, is that we, I think, may begin to understand ourselves and others more clearly when we treat positive and negative affect as complementary rather than as opposing forces. And in the work on stress adaptation, it may be most useful to see our sort of emotional worlds as two separate systems. Klein's proposed a metaphor for these two systems in his 1989 book. He wrote, "It's like holding the reins of a horse-drawn carriage. You can pull to activate, but you cannot push to get the opposite. You need another rein to pull the horse on another side to guide its course." These two systems, I think, operate in parallel most of the time, with some key exceptions. And one of those key exceptions, I think, is stress. And the other point I think that's worth mentioning is that, individual differences, and there's this question of, what is to be gained by living sort of emotionally rich lives. And I think one of the things that is gained is resilience, or this sort of capacity for recovery, right? So when we're able to keep our positive and negative affects separate from one another, that provides more information about what are the things that sort of influence our positive affective states that don't influence our negative affective states. And to the extent that this is true, I think resilience, as my collaborator Alex Zoter likes to put it, is more than a metaphor. I think here we can sort of understand that resilience is about having perspective, having emotional awareness on the stressor in such a way that we're able to see our positive and negative emotions as independent. So I'll stop there.